So I'd like to start by thanking the organizing committee for inviting me to Vancouver, a city that's very close to my heart, because this is actually where I started neuroimaging. Back in 1999 as an exchange student with an undergraduate research project that ended up in neuroimage. So to be able to come back here 18 years later to give a keynote really is a very special experience. Thank you very much for that. So I want to give you a bit of an overview of some of the work that we do on decision making, the neural mechanisms that allow us to select the best course of action in any given moment of time. Like many other labs, we're interested in these processes because we believe that they may help us understand why we behave the way we do and why some of us may show pathological types of behavior that cause lots of problems for the affected individuals and society as a whole. However, I think studying decisions can tell us a lot about how the brain works as a dynamic, interconnected system, because the decision-making processes need to draw flexibly on information from many specialized subsystems. For instance, any decision requires information from sensory systems about what the choice options actually are, information from affective and interoceptive systems about what it is that we want and what our body may need, information from memory systems about the properties of the choice options and our experiences with them, and information from social systems about what consequences our actions may have on the people around us. If this is a bit abstract for you, perhaps a practical example helps. We're in Vancouver, so we all eat sushi all the time. When deciding which of these 5 nigiri to pick, you probably use affective information, so you simulate the taste and how much you would like it. You may use perceptual information, so which of these is the biggest and most likely to satiate you. You may use social information, decide whether or not to follow recommendations of other people on the table. And you definitely need memory information to tell you that these are different cuts of tuna and that the best of these cuts is obviously one, the fatty belly. So you don't only use one of these types of informations, but you integrate them all and you weight them flexibly to suit your current needs. How does this work? How does your brain allow you to do this? Well, we know surprisingly little about this very central aspect of decision-making because it's rarely studied. Instead, most existing studies break down complexity by presenting just one type of information to the participants. For example, in studies of value-based decision-makings, participants are usually shown symbols that are associated with different magnitudes or probabilities of financial payoffs. And this line of research is really interested in finding out how the brain represents and compares the values associated with these different options, which seems to reliably involve midline structures such as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and so forth. In a completely separate line of research on perceptual decisions, researchers take a very different approach. They give participants noisy pictures of objects and ask them to classify them. For example, is the stimulus a face or a house, or is there motion to the left or to the right, and so forth. This line of research is less interested in where the information used to take the choice is represented. We think we know that quite well already. But it's more interested in identifying choice processes that basically extract the signal from the noise and commit to one of the alternative interpretations. And this seems to reliably involve regions in lateral and intraparietal cortex and the frontal eye fields. And in yet another separate line of research, researchers have people take these decisions, but now in the presence of other people who may collaborate or compete. And this line of research is really interested in how these social influences on choices are implemented by the brain, which seems often to take place in regions such as the temporoparietal junction and regions of the prefrontal cortex. So seeing these largely separate lines of research and noticing the lack of overlap in the involved structures has led to proposals that choices in these different situations are fundamentally different aspects of our behavior, and that the brain may in fact have developed separate subsystems to control these behaviors with their own unique anatomical substrates and ways to process information. In my talk today, I'd like to challenge this view. I want to present a series of studies for which the basic logic is that we believe while there certainly is functional specialization for representing affective and perceptual and social information, it's very unlikely that the brain has in fact developed very different ways to deal with these informations to control our choices. Such completely separate choice architectures would be very energy inefficient, very inflexible, very hard to coordinate in real life, where all these pieces of information are present simultaneously. Instead, I want to present you some studies where we seem to find unified choice mechanisms that flexibly draw on these different pieces of information to control our choices. And because I presented some of our work on social decision-making last year in Geneva, I'll focus on studies where we compare choices based on subjective values and percepts. So one of the reasons why we believe that these processes may not be so apparent in many of the existing studies is that the researchers in the different domains use very different stimuli, paradigms, and computational models to study these processes, which allows them to focus on different aspects of this choice architecture, but which prevents us from finding out what the overlap is. So in our tasks, we try to identify specifically this overlap by using tasks where we present participants with identical stimuli, give them the same task set and instructions for motor outputs. We only vary whether they use perceptual or affective information in order to take their choices. Moreover, we use the same models of the choice processes and also of how the information that needs access to this choice processes is processed in order to identify the overlap. So I'll start with some studies that try to identify these choice processes. In all these experiments, which we do with EEG, fMRI, and transcranial alternating current stimulation, participants are asked to select from pairs of food stimuli that we sample from the full palette available at this largest Swiss supermarket brand, the item that they would like to eat at the end of the experiment. And these choices are real. Participants come to the lab hungry, and one of these choices is implemented, so they get to eat what they choose. However, on other sets of trials in the same experiment, we asked them to take a perceptual decision on these items, so to tell us which of these two items covers more of the standardized black background. Now, crucially, before the experiment, we have participants rate all the items, how much they would like to eat them, and how large they are. So we can select for each participant a unique stimulus set where these two pieces of information are fully decorrelated. Moreover, we can select the items so that we can give participants on different trials more or less evidence for one of the choice options by making the difference in value or size between these two items or selecting that in a controlled fashion. And this has clear effects on behavior. So the more similar the values or the sizes of the items are, the less accurate the choices are, so the less likely participants are to correctly identify the item that they told us they like better, or the item that is bigger, and the slower choices are. Now, equipped with this paradigm and these data, we now try to identify the processes that the brain uses in order to extract this information and use it for choice. And we do this by employing sequential sampling models. There's different variants of these models, but they all assume that the evidence that you use for choice, so the difference in value or the difference in size, is represented by noisy activity of groups of sensory neurons in the brain. Now, what the choice processes do is that they integrate this information over time by summation all the way until a particular threshold value is reached, at which time the choice is triggered. Now, what's very attractive about these models for us is that they're process models. This means that they make predictions not just about the accuracy, but also about the speed, the reaction time of choices with different levels of evidence. Because the larger the evidence, the larger this noisy activity, and the faster the choices happen, and the less likely it is that they become dominated by noise. Moreover, these models give us pretty precise predictions for the types of signals that we should be looking for in EEG data when trying to identify these choice processes. So we use one specific variant of these models, Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, which captures these processes with different parameters. And when fitting this to the data from both types of choices, we find that it accounts very well for behavior. So the predictions here are displayed as triangles and the data as squares. And you can see that reaction times and accuracies for both types of choices are well predicted, or basically accounted for. And what I want to point out is that the parameters of the fitted model were actually identical for the two types of choices, which already tells us that the process seems to operate in a very similar fashion for both types of choices. We now use this parameterized model to derive predictions for the types of signals that we should be seeing in the EEG signals in the time point leading up to the choice. So time point 0 here corresponds to the motor response. And we now inspect the EEG data for these neural traces. What we find is that for the perceptual choices, there are indeed increases in the power of oscillations in the mid-gamma range over a set of sensors over parietal cortex that follow exactly the pattern predicted by the model. And we find evidence that a very, very similar process, a very similar choice process seems to be implemented also for the value-based choices, because the very same signals are present, statistically indistinguishable in the same sensors. However, there are additional oscillations actually now over frontopolar sensors as well, and these were indeed significantly stronger for value-based and perceptual choices. Before starting to interpret this pattern, I want to point out that these are not just trivial fits with any kind of rising signal, but we perform out-of-sample validations in completely independent data, showing that if you extract the signals from the same sensors, you find very, very good fits with the predictions of the models for these choice processes. Now, to us, the overlap of these oscillatory choice signals over these parietal sensors seems very suggestive that there may be this shared choice process occurring in parietal areas, and that for value-based choices, that it flexibly draws on value information computed in frontopolar regions. Now, with EEG, it's very difficult to draw such inferences, of course, so we repeat the very same experiment with fMRI, and find that both signals indeed correlate with the model predictions for both types of choices in regions of the parietal cortex that are routinely found for these evidence accumulation processes in perceptual choices only. Whereas we find that there really is a significant difference in the fits of these predictions in the areas that are routinely found for the construction of values in value-based choice tasks. So these signals are present for value-based choice, but not for perceptual choices, adding some substance that these areas may be the generators of these signals. Now, assuming this choice architecture, one would think that the two oscillators that we see for value-based choices must work in tandem. If the choice process accumulates evidence generated by the frontal oscillator, we should see synchronization in the oscillations of these two oscillators. And this is indeed the case. When we calculate coherence, we find that in precisely this mid-gamma range, this is significantly increased for value-based versus perceptual choices. And this increase in coherence is indeed relevant for behavior. So it is significantly increased for correct versus incorrect choices for value-based decisions, not for perceptual decisions. And it correlates significantly with the accuracy of value-based decisions, not perceptual decisions. I wonder what that sound is. Does anyone know? Can anyone switch this off? So correlation is obviously not causation. So to get some evidence that this coherence is indeed functionally relevant for behavior, we tried to basically disrupt this coherence between these areas and test whether that selectively affects the accuracy of value-based choices. To do this, we employed a technique known as transcranial alternating current stimulation. So we fix electrodes over the very same regions that showed these EEG signals, and we apply oscillatory currents at exactly these mid-gamma frequencies that we saw in the EEG. So it's known from invasive recording in rats and from human studies that this can mildly but consistently entrain oscillations in the same frequency band under the electrodes. So by applying these currents with a 180-degree phase shift, so completely desynchronized, we aim to decouple these areas and test to what degree this really has selective effects on value-based choices. By comparing choices taken during this stimulation with choices taken in the same session but without any such stimulation, so sham, or also conditions where we apply these oscillatory currents but perfectly in phase. And the results are the same as predicted. We see that this manipulation does not really affect the accuracy of perceptual choices, but it does affect the accuracy of value-based choices in a very specific pattern that may seem counterintuitive at first. While we see that the stimulation has no effect on the choices that should be most difficult, so where the choice options are very similar in value, it does have strong effects for those choices that should be easy, because there's a big difference. Further modeling illuminated where this comes from and showed that these effects are indeed very specific influences on the choice process, not just induction of some neural noise. So when fitting the model to these data, we found that this specifically affected just one parameter characterizing the choice process. It didn't delay it, it didn't increase the boundary needed for the choice to be triggered, and it didn't even change the efficiency of information integration overall. But what it did change is the variability over trials with which the value information was integrated into choice, known as drift variability. Selectively so for value-based choices, not for perceptual choices. And when using this fitted model now, and to simulate what effect this should have on behavior, we saw that the fitted model indeed predicted precisely the pattern that we saw in our empirical data, arguing quite strongly that what this stimulation paradigm does is not just inducing some kind of noise or making you more random in your choices, but quite selectively affecting how the value information in one of these areas is incorporated into choices. Now, as the last piece of evidence for this assumption, or this interpretation, that we really have a unified choice process in parietal cortex that collects information from frontopolar cortex, we tested for the directionality of this communication between the two areas. The basic assumption here is that since synchronization may serve to increase the impact of spikes generated in one area on the other area, the area that's leading in terms of phase slightly is the one that's sending the signals that really impact, because this delay in phase lag accounts perfectly for the delay in information transmission along axons. So in order to test for this, we repeat the same TSS experiment, but we now vary the phase lag between the oscillations applied over the frontopolar and the parietal electrode in 6 equidistant steps. And consistent with our interpretation, we find that there's one specific phase lag at which the stimulation has the maximum effect. And this phase lag is most consistent, if you fit a sinusoidal model, with a phase shift by which the frontal oscillations lead the parietal oscillations, about 30 degrees. So this really is consistent with this notion that the choice process in parietal cortex is collecting information from frontal cortex about value specifically in order to bring about choice. So this first set of studies really is consistent with the notion that once we start matching stimuli and start studying value-based and perceptual decisions on the same footing, we don't really see a very kind of specialized architecture for choices, but we see evidence for shared neural choice processes that are quite well captured by sequential sampling models, seem housed in parietal areas, and that seem to flexibly connect with areas computing values during value-based choices by means of long-range gamma coherence. So this choice architecture obviously poses the question of how it can really flexibly access information in very different areas that are anatomically separate and presumably even code information somewhat differently. So in the second set of studies that I want to present, we basically try to identify whether there may be shared principles of how choice information is represented in these systems that may facilitate it for this mechanism to select, access, and integrate this information. And the basic logic of these studies is that we try to identify such principles established in sensory systems and try to see to what degree they are also present in value systems. So the first of these is attention. It's well established that if animals or humans attend to a particular sensory dimension and respond to it, then the neural representations corresponding to this dimension can be significantly enhanced. Here's an example from macaque MT. When the monkey attends to motion and reports it, the responses are enhanced, and such signatures are seen in all sensory systems. And this enhancement is basically meant to strengthen these neural representations and make them easy to access for behavioral report. However, there's a second set of principles, and that's bottom-up attentional modulation. So stimuli that are highly salient and elicit strong bottom-up activity can actually also get noticed even though they're not currently attended, and they can become inside the focus of attention and distract us from what we're currently doing. Phenomenon known as attentional capture. So we reasoned that both of these mechanisms would be very efficient ways by which a supramodal choice mechanism may also select and perhaps notice value information that's relevant for behavioral control. So we basically now ask the questions, can we find similar principles at work in the value system? Our reasoning was simple. we were looking for value representations in the system that are enhanced when value is choice relevant. So when you're selecting which of these nigiri to eat, the value representation should be enhanced compared to when you're just arranging them visually. And the degree of this top-down modulation should relate to the accuracy of your value-based choice. On the other hand, we're of course also looking for the feature that value representation should also be present when they're completely choice irrelevant, and the strength of this representation should relate to how much your attention is captured by this item. Something that may happen to you when you're on the way to the conference center and all of a sudden you notice quite a good restaurant that would also be a good place to go to. So we looked for these principles in a paradigm that was closely related, but we didn't use food stimuli this time, we used movies. Participants were presented with an auditory price in one set of trials and were asked whether or not they want to buy this movie at the stated price. In another set of trials, we presented a certain number of faces and asked them, does this movie cover contain this number of faces, yes or no? So again, value-based or perceptual information. Again, we used ratings to basically select stimuli where these two these two pieces of information were completely decorrelated. And we ascertained with behavioral data that participants only chose based on either type of information for these choices. So for purchasing choices, the accuracy and speed of responses was only affected by the subjective values, SV, not by the number of faces. And for perceptual choices, the converse was the case, but there was an interesting piece of data that showed us already attentional capture at work. Because what you can see is that when participants decide how many faces are on the cover, the subjective value has an effect on the reaction time. So the more valuable this DVD is, even though that just has nothing to do with what you're meant to do, makes you slower. When now looking in the valuation system, that was of course highly representing values during the purchasing choices, when looking for these two aspects of representations, we found an interesting dissociation. Only one of these areas, the VMPFC, showed signs of top-down modulation. In other words, value in this area was not represented during perceptual choices, but it was very strongly represented when participants chose based on values. And the degree of this top-down enhancement, so the slope change from one trial type to the other, actually had a significant correlation with the accuracy of the value-based choices, just as predicted. This was not the case for the value representations in the PCC, which had a very, very different property because they looked very much like bottom-up value representations. They were similarly present for both types of choices, and the steepness of the slope, just for the perceptual choices, in fact, related to the degree of attentional capture by the value of these DVDs during the unrelated perceptual task. So what this basically tells us is that this principle of attention that's so generically expressed in sensory systems and is thought to aid selection of information also is present in value systems and may thus be a very generic mechanism by which choice processes can flexibly select and combine these different pieces of information. And for those of you who like the value system, I'd like to point out that this dissociation may be quite interesting because the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the PCC are routinely found to represent value in these studies of value-based decision-making. And the question really is, why should there be this distributed coding of value? And our data suggests that this could be because the two areas serve somewhat distinct behavioral functions, with the ventral medial prefrontal cortex perhaps aiding you to choose based on values, and the posterior cingulate cortex helping you to notice valuable objects even though they're outside your current focus of attention. So the second principle that we thought may aid these supramodal choice processes is neural population coding. It's well established that in sensory systems, particular aspects of stimuli are encoded by different subpopulations of neurons that are each tuned to specific values. For example, for motion, we know that in area V5, there are distinct groups of neurons that are tuned to particular motion directions, and together they cover the full range of motion directions. Now, something that's very interesting about these coding schemes is that the full population response, shown here, carries information not just about what motion direction is likely to be present, but also how certain you should be that it really is this motion direction. Because the width, basically, of this specific response here tells you whether there's very reliably just one motion direction with very little noise, if it's a very spiky response, or whether it's a very noisy response in case there's a very wide population response here. And several models have been developed, most of them Bayesian, that can explicitly decode from these population responses the certainty associated with this particular sensory response. And there's actually quite a few theories that say that humans use this information about the certainty of information representation to adequately integrate information. So during multisensory choices, for example, where there may be more noise in vision than in audition, participants are well able to weight these channels according to the estimates of their reliability. So during night, we may rely more on audition, whereas during the day, we may rely more on what we see. So we thought that this principle, if it were expressed in ventromedial prefrontal cortex, could also be a very efficient way by which the brain could actually choose how much to decide based on values or on percepts. Unfortunately, we know not very much about tuning functions in ventromedial prefrontal cortex because there isn't a lot of invasive recording work done. But the few studies that have started to emerge over the last years are actually consistent with a scheme by which there may be different populations of neurons in OFC that code different parts of preference space and have tuning for it. So we said, if we assume such a coding scheme, can we decode from neural activity patterns or bold activity patterns in VMPFC the reliability of preferences for objects that you basically see? The way we did this is that we put participants in the scanner and showed them again images of food items and asked them how much they wanted to eat them, from not at all to very much. We explicitly separated the phase where participants saw these items and thought about their preference from the phase where they gave the motor response in order to have neural data from the time point where they simply thought about their preference. And what we then did is that we used this Bayesian decoding approach to now construct the full probability density function over preferences associated with each of these items. In order to get a behavioral benchmark first for how certain participants were of their preferences, we asked them to rate these items twice. So there were 2 rounds of ratings. And we could just look at how variable the preference ratings were from the first to the second rating. And for 3 separate data sets with different rating scales and so forth, we found the same pattern, where preferences were very reliable for items that you didn't like at all, or items that you liked very much, but that there was much higher variability around the middle of the rating scales for items that you didn't care about a lot. Which does make a lot of sense, because only items that you really want to eat or absolutely want to avoid are those where you should really have very, very precise preferences. Now, equipped with this behavioral marker of preference uncertainty, we could now construct the neural marker of preference uncertainty. The way we did this is that we selected in ventromedial prefrontal cortex the 100 voxels with the strongest response to all stimuli, and we constructed now a matrix of these voxels responses over all trials. And we used this Bayesian decoding approach to construct these probability density functions. The way we did it is that we borrowed a model developed for sensory cortex by Van Bergen et al. To decode uncertainty in V1 encoding of orientation, discrimination. This model essentially assumes that the response of each of these voxels is a sum of 8 neural populations that are tuned to different parts of value space. They have their own population-specific noise. They're expressed in different concentrations in each voxel. And of course, there's this shared noise that plagues us so much in fMRI research that had nothing to do with the population encoding. We then fitted the parameters of this model to our data in a leave one out cross-validation approach. So we fitted the model in all but one run, and then used Bayesian model inversion to now construct for the data that was left out the probability of a preference being present on every trial, given the data from VMPFC that the model sees and the parameters that we fitted. So here's examples for 2 trials for this PDF. The model in both of these trials correctly infers that the participants had a mid-preference, so didn't care too much about the item. But the model is much more certain here than here, because the PDF is much narrower here than here. So the width of this PDF was a measure of neural preference uncertainty. And reassuringly, this related very strongly to the measure of behavioral preference uncertainty. So participants who on average, or whose VMPFC on average showed very unreliable neural representations were also those who had the strongest variability in the ratings given 10 seconds later. Reassuringly as well, we found that this particular approach worked best with the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So when we tried it with responses in other areas that are also involved in coding values, we did not find this relationship to be present so strongly, arguing that this coding scheme that's best established perhaps for ventromedial prefrontal cortex seems to be most expressed in these data. Now, as the final test, we also wanted to show that the neural preference uncertainty decoded in the scanner related to the accuracy of value-based choices at a later time. So after the experiment, we asked participants to take choices between the very same food items outside the scanner. And what I'm plotting here is the probability of choosing the upper item of each pair as a function of the value difference between the upper and the lower item. So the steepness of these curves tells you how accurate the value-based choices are with the previous ratings, so how consistent people are in identifying the item that they said before is the better one for them. And as you can see, this curve here is indeed significantly shallower for those items where both behavior and the neural decoding indicate to us that there's a high uncertainty in preferences. So in other words, just by looking at the pattern of VMPFC response when you're looking at an item allows you to predict to a certain degree how stable preference-based choices will be on these very same items at a later time. And this was also present at the between subject level. So those participants for whom there was the highest degree of uncertainty in the VMPFC representations were also those who had the least accurate choices. So to wrap this up, these data suggest that similar to how perceptual information is coded in sensory cortices, value information may be coded in the VMPFC with a population coding scheme that carries information about how reliable this information is. And this, of course, can be valuable information for these domain general choice mechanisms that can help in deciding how much to integrate them into the choice process. So, where do we stand? I started with the question whether we should take the existing literature as evidence that the brain has developed distinct systems that control different parts of our behavior, value-based, perceptual, and social choices. I hope you agree that we probably shouldn't. Instead, a lot of what the literature shows may reflect, in fact, the specific choices that the researchers in these different domains took collectively about the stimuli, tasks, and models that they employ to study these aspects of behavior. And I think this chimes in quite well with what we heard from Talia Koni 2 days ago, who actually said that the choice that we take about the stimuli that we select for our experiments may lead to statistical biases. So I think our data may show that the choice of stimuli can also lead to particular conceptual foci that may suggest more functional specialization than there actually is. Because once we start really matching decisions based on these different types of information for stimuli, tasks, and models, we find that there actually is quite a bit of evidence that there's shared neural choice processes that flexibly decide based on these different types of information. They can be captured by the same models, and they may collect this information with similar mechanisms related perhaps to oscillatory coherence. Moreover, these processes seem aided by the fact that even in specialized subsystems that are thought to operate very differently, there can be similar principles of how information is represented that can aid selection and integration. For example, this information can be enhanced in a top-down fashion to be selected, can be enhanced in a bottom-up fashion in order to be noticed, even though you're not currently paying attention to it. And it may be represented by coding schemes that give you information about how certain you are of this information, which also is, of course, quite valuable. Now, I focused my talk really on decisions based on values and percepts, but of course, I don't think that this line of research should be restricted to these types of information. I think we have every reason to believe that similar mechanisms may be at place when we decide based on, say, for example, social information or even memory information. And I think it would make sense really for the decision-making field to start paying a bit more attention and trying to characterize these truly supramodal choice processes and principles. Because ultimately, I think what we need really is a big integrated model of how decisions work in real life, where all these pieces of information are present, because that's what ultimately we may need to practically apply these models in clinical contexts, for example. Because for many psychiatric disorders, problems with the control of behavior are not narrowly restricted to just one aspect of their life. So not just to interactions with others or financial choices, but can really be quite prevalent in all aspects of their life. And I think such integrated models may be very useful in that case to help us understand what may be going wrong and hopefully to help these patients. So I'd like to end by thanking the three brilliant postdocs who did this work with me, Rafael Polania, Marcos Grucio, and Marius Moisa. My other collaborators on these projects, Ian Kreibig and Todd Hare, the other members of my group and my collaborators in Zurich, and finally Todd Woodward here at UBC, who 18 years ago convinced me to abandon my original plans for the exchange year and getting involved in neuroimaging. Thank you very much. I'm surprised, yeah.
So we have time for questions. While people are moving to the microphone, I'll ask a question. You're a master of integrating different methodologies. So my question to you is trying to do source estimation on the EEG data so that then you can maybe get some timing information on some of these processes neurally.
Yes, I mean, we actually tried it for this particular study, and there was certain problems. So we decided that it was better for us to actually just replicate the experiment with fMRI and try to do it that way. But I fully agree. That's obviously a very promising thing to do.
And it looks like the activity you could probably model quite well. That you're getting, if it matches the fMRI data. So, yeah.
Yes, that's of course the hope and the assumption.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question at the microphone.
All right. Christian, thank you for a really elegant series of studies. I hope you can just clarify something about the interpretation. So the main point you made was sort of that these are all really potentially very different systems with different inputs, but it seems like you did actually show that there's something special about the ventromedial PFC for encoding value. So that's, how do you, interpret that? Is it about the content of what's going into the decision-making process, first of all? And what's the parietal cortex doing, and is that response selective?
Mm-hmm. No, so that really is the central point that I wanted to make. There is functional specialization for the processing of different pieces of information. So affective states are, of course, processed in different areas than sensory stimuli, or perhaps information about your social environment. But the way that the brain uses this information finally to select an action, there I think we do have processes that must be shared between these different domains. And we believe that these parietal oscillators that we find there, that could be one of these sites. Yeah.
And just quickly, if you change the output type, do you think then that parietal cortex would no longer be important? It would be something else?
That's a question that's really being investigated quite intensively at the moment. There are some studies that seem to suggest that it does not depend on the response modality, and other studies do. So I hope we have to wait a little bit until we have the answer to that.
Question at microphone 2.
Hi, yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. So I had a question about the interpretation of the top-down portion of the talk. So normally I think of the top-down effect to be mostly inhibitory, and you see a lot of these attention effects where the effect is actually inhibitory and you don't end up with an enhancement. So, but you seem to find an enhancement, right, for the attention effect. So I was wondering, in light of the, what I think is the maybe more common finding of having a top-down effect be inhibitory. If you think the enhancement you observed is maybe due to interactions with other cortical areas that weren't part necessarily of the parietal and frontal connection.
So the actual nature of how this top-down modulation, the top-down net enhancement, yeah, of the relevant dimension is achieved may be different, yeah, between sensory systems and the VMPFC. I think what we're seeing in the VMPFC really is that the value representations there are something that's actively constructed. So it could be a sampling process, possibly from memory. That's what some people seem to propose at the moment. So I don't think that the precise mechanisms by which the net enhancement is produced must be the same. But the end result, that the information that you are meant to use for choice and that you want to have maximally active relative to noise may be the same.
All right, if there are no further questions, and there might be some shy people, you might be able to come and interact with Dr. Ruff. So please join me in thanking Dr. Ruff for a wonderful talk.